That day, sitting in my car in the company parking lot, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The weight of the wedding ring I'd carried for so many years seemed greater than ever on my fingers, as if it now carried not only the commitment, but also the lies and disappointments that came with it. I took it off my finger, closed my hand tightly and, for a moment, remained motionless. Then I looked at the small package resting on the bench next to me, containing the ring in a handwritten note. It was a calculated gesture, cruel perhaps, but necessary. I handed everything over to her boss with a simple, direct request: leave this on her desk. Today. A few hours later, she received what I had planned. They say that despair can be seen in the eyes even before the tears fall, and that's what happened. Her expression changed the instant she saw that little shiny object resting in the center of her desk. A mixture of panic and guilt invaded her face. She knew. There was no need to say anything. She knew that the house of cards she had so carefully built was crumbling. She called me right away. The calls piled up on my cell phone screen, but I didn't answer. There was nothing more to be said at that moment. Instead, I let her face the weight of that alliance and the decision I had already made. "How could you do this to me?" I read in the desperate message that arrived shortly afterwards. It was almost comical. How could I? Maybe that was the wrong question. How could she? The details began to emerge weeks ago. Little signs that I didn't want to see, but that were there, insistent. Messages that were quickly deleted, calls that she only answered away from me, and a scent in the air that wasn't ours. At first, I convinced myself that I was being paranoid, but instinct never fails. I started to pay attention, to put the pieces together. And then, one day, I followed in her footsteps. When I saw with my own eyes what was happening, the betrayal wasn't the only thing that hit me. It was the coldness, the naturalness with which she lived that lie. While I was putting food on our table, while I was making plans for a future together, she was building another kind of life, a world in which I wasn't welcome. "That doesn't mean anything," she would say if confronted. It was a mistake. But it wasn't. Mistakes happen once, by accident, but this was different. It was premeditated, organized, as if she had planned every step to make sure I never found out. The weeks that followed were a theater of falsehoods. She became more affectionate than ever, trying to hide what she knew was about to come out. Carefully prepared dinners, unexpected hugs, nights when she pulled me close and whispered things I hadn't heard in years. Only now I knew the truth, and it all seemed empty. Just a desperate effort to mask the inevitable. However, what she could never have imagined was that I was no longer playing the same game. Her every fake smile was a reminder of what I needed to do. Every touch was a reminder of the ring that was on my hand, and how it would be returned in the most symbolic way possible. When she came out of the house that morning, smiling and waving as if everything was perfect, I knew it was time. There was no hesitation. Handing that little token to her boss wasn't just a declaration that I knew. It was the start of something bigger. Her world was about to come crashing down, and I wanted her to feel every brick fall. When she received her wedding ring back at work, she ran to the bathroom and locked herself in. Some colleagues noticed, but no one had the courage to ask. Inside, between muffled sobs and trembling hands, she tried to call him. The other one. But this time he didn't answer either. What she didn't know was that my silence wasn't a cry of contained anger. It was a strategy. While she stood there, her guilt suffocating her, I had already taken a step forward. I knew everything, messages, meetings and more. I even knew who he was. And that's why, that same afternoon, rumors began to circulate in the company. I wasn't the one who told. I never had to. A truth like that is like a virus, it spreads on its own. While she struggled to understand what was going on, I began to move my pieces on the board. Every call ignored, every message deleted from my screen, was further evidence that the power was finally in my hands. I still remember her face when we saw each other again a few days later. She was different. Despair had transformed her. She looked smaller, more vulnerable, as if everything that made her shine had disappeared. But there, right in front of me, was still the mystery. Why? Not just the betrayal, but what made her do it. There was something else, something she was hiding. Something I still didn't know. And that's when I realized, maybe the real betrayal hadn't been revealed yet. Welcome to our channel. Here, we never support any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can devastate lives, break bonds and leave deep scars. Now, get ready for an intense narrative full of twists and turns. A shocking story is about to begin. Happy listening. The soft light of dawn came through the half-open curtains of the room, illuminating the space with a golden hue. It was an ordinary morning for Daniel and Mariana. The couple, married for over 8 years, lived in a beautiful townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. To the outside eye, they were the picture of happiness, a solid marriage, promising careers and a life apparently without major turbulence. However, like any relationship, things were more complex than appearances made them out to be. Daniel was methodical, detail-oriented and dedicated to his work. An engineer by profession, he spent much of his time involved in challenging projects, but made a point of reserving the early morning for a ritual he considered sacred, preparing coffee for himself and Mariana. He believed that these small gestures were the basis of any lasting relationship. He watched her sitting at the table, her hair messy and looking away as she scrolled through the news on her cell phone, and felt a mixture of pride and frustration. Mariana, on the other hand, was a charming woman, her gaze always full of emotion. A psychologist, she had built a solid career helping other people find emotional balance, although she often felt that her own balance was crumbling. In recent months, something had changed in her. An inexplicable emptiness had set in, something that not even she could identify. Daniel, so attentive to work details, seemed oblivious to the subtle transformation in his wife. However, the routine was a kind of anesthetic. They both settled into a dynamic in which the days blended together and the nights became predictable. Mariana missed the spontaneity, the surprises that once marked the beginning of their relationship. Daniel, on the other hand, believed that stability was a sign of success. In his eyes, a marriage without major conflicts was the greatest triumph. They talked, but the conversations had lost their intensity. The casual and secure tone of before had given way to practical and objective dialogues, as if feelings were just an obligation between daily commitments. Mariana used to say that Daniel was an honorable man, someone she trusted completely. He had always been her safe haven, especially in difficult times. When her father died, it was Daniel who held her hand at the wake, murmuring words of comfort. He supported her in her decision to change jobs, encouraged her to take a postgraduate course, and was by her side for every achievement. But now there was something in Mariana that seemed restless, as if she was looking for something beyond what life as a couple could offer. Daniel, for his part, was unable to perceive the cracks that were beginning to appear. Perhaps because of his stubborn optimism, he believed that things would simply settle down over time. Deep down, he was also missing something. He didn't know exactly what, but the feeling was constant. Even so, he preferred not to confront it directly. He believed that hard work and dedication to the home were enough to keep everything on track. That particular morning, something seemed different, although neither of them could verbalize what it was. Mariana silently watched Daniel as he adjusted the buttons on his shirt before leaving for work. He kissed her quickly on the forehead, a mechanical gesture that was repeated every day. "See you later," he said, smiling. Mariana replied with a nod, but the feeling that something was out of place remained. As Daniel drove to the office, his mind was full of numbers, graphs and deadlines. He liked the controlled environment of work, where every problem had a logical solution. On the other hand, Mariana dedicated her day to listening to other people's stories, often so full of emotional complexity that she felt the weight of other people's lives piling up on her own shoulders. She helped others to find meaning in their existence, but lately she hadn't been able to apply the same to herself. That day, during a session with a client, Mariana found herself reflecting on her own relationship. The woman in front of her, a successful businesswoman, was talking about the monotony of her marriage and how it made her question whether she had made the right decisions in life. Mariana felt uncomfortable when she realized that she saw a lot of herself in that story. Is that what's bothering me? She thought. But she quickly pushed the thought aside and concentrated on offering professional support. As the day progressed, the hours seemed to drag by. Daniel was bogged down in endless meetings, while Mariana felt the mental fatigue of a day full of appointments. When evening came, they found themselves in the same physical space, but still emotionally distant. Mariana prepared dinner, while Daniel watched the news on television. The conversation was sparse. He talked about a problem at work, she talked about a client who was having an anxiety crisis. But deep down, neither of them really listened to the other. That night, as they lay side by side, Mariana looked at Daniel with a mixture of affection and sadness. "Are you all right?" he asked, noticing the thoughtful expression on her face. She hesitated, but replied with a false smile, "Yes, I am. I'm just tired." He didn't insist. He just switched off the light and wished her good night, believing that the answer was enough. Mariana stayed awake for a while longer, listening to Daniel's rhythmic breathing as he slept. She felt a pang of guilt for something she couldn't name. She knew he was a good man, but even so, a growing dissatisfaction took over her thoughts. Daniel, on the other hand, slept peacefully, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions occupying his wife's mind. What neither of them knew was that this apparently harmless routine was about to be irreversibly shaken. The days went by with a strange predictability, but in the small details, the tension began to build up like a storm about to erupt. Daniel remained immersed in his routine, focused on work, while Mariana seemed more distant every day. The connection that had once been natural now seemed like an effort, a veiled obligation. They both realized that something was wrong, but neither dared to broach the subject. One morning, Daniel was late leaving the house. A fault with the coffee maker made him look for the repair in the kitchen cupboard, and that's when he found something he hadn't expected. While moving a pile of boxes, he came across a small black bag. It wasn't unusual to find things like this. Mariana was organized, but not always as methodical as he was. However, when he opened the bag in search of something, he found something that intrigued him: 2 tickets for a dinner at a fancy restaurant, booked for that very evening. It wasn't the kind of place they frequented together. He hesitated, but chose not to mention anything. He put his bag back, trying not to jump to conclusions. That evening, Mariana said she had a work appointment and would be back late. Daniel pretended not to care, mumbling something about needing to revise reports. However, the discomfort grew in his chest like a stone that was impossible to swallow. He tried to distract himself with work, but his mind was stuck on the idea that something wasn't right. Finally, the curiosity became unbearable. He took the car and, without a clear plan, drove to the restaurant indicated on the ticket. He parked across the street, feeling a mixture of guilt and anxiety. For a few minutes, he stood motionless, watching people go in and out of the place. He was almost convinced he was being paranoid, but then she appeared. Mariana stepped out of a black car, elegantly dressed. Her expression was different, there was no sign of tiredness or worry. Instead, she looked alive, almost radiant, as she adjusted her dress and walked towards the entrance. At her side, a tall, well-built man accompanied her. They laughed together, and the likeness between them was evident. Daniel felt his stomach turn. He tried to justify what he was seeing. Perhaps he was a client or an old friend. But when the two of them walked in hand, all denial fell to the ground. Inside the car, Daniel felt the blood rushing to his face, his breathing quickening. He thought about confronting them right there, but decided not to act on impulse. He needed proof, something that couldn't be denied. He pulled out his cell phone, took a few discreet photos and then followed the couple to the entrance of the restaurant. He stood outside, watching through the window as the two sat at a secluded table. The conversation seemed intimate, with smiles exchanged and looks that Daniel hadn't seen on Mariana's face for some time. As he watched, flashes of past moments invaded his mind, their wedding day, the trips they had taken together, the nights they had spent planning for the future. Now it all seemed like a farce. He wanted to run, but something stopped him. The feeling of betrayal was so strong that it felt physical, a weight on his chest that held him in place. Inside, Daniel was fighting the emotions that were consuming him. Anger, sadness, humiliation. He tried to find answers, justifications to explain why this was happening, but nothing made sense. Mariana, the woman he loved and trusted above all else, was there, in another world, with someone else. When they left the restaurant, Daniel followed them discreetly to their car. The man opened the door for Mariana, and the two exchanged a brief kiss before getting in. Daniel felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. There was no longer any doubt. The betrayal was before his eyes, naked and stark, with no room for interpretation. He stood there, watching as the car disappeared into the distance. Back at home, Daniel tried to process what he had seen. He sat on the sofa in the living room, staring into nothingness, while his mind revisited every detail of the night. The weight of the betrayal was overwhelming. He wanted to confront Mariana immediately, but something stopped him. It wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, a sense of loss, of abandonment. He realized that it wasn't just his marriage that was at stake, it was his identity, his perception of who he was, and what his life meant. When Mariana returned home later, she found Daniel already in bed. He pretended to be asleep, unable to face her at that moment. He felt her approach, hesitated for a moment, and then lay down beside her. No words were exchanged, but her presence beside him seemed to carry something different. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just his own imagination. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to act normal, but the tension was palpable. He began to observe Mariana more closely, noticing details that he had previously ignored, messages that were quickly deleted, excuses for appointments that came up at the last minute, and a kind of lightness that seemed to emerge every time she went out. Each new detail was like a stab, reinforcing the idea that the betrayal was not an isolated episode, but something that had taken hold in his life without him realizing it. On the other hand, Mariana also seemed different. Although she tried to keep to her routine, there were times when she seemed absent, as if she were somewhere else, with someone else. She also noticed the change in Daniel, but preferred not to ask. Deep down, she feared what he might say. Daniel knew he couldn't go on living like this. He needed answers, he needed to confront her. But above all, he needed to understand why this was happening. What had changed? When had their love lost its way? These questions tormented him, but he knew he would only get answers if he faced the situation head-on. One evening, while Mariana was in the shower, Daniel picked up her cell phone, which had been left on the bedside table. He hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity and desire to discover the truth were stronger. When he unlocked the screen, he found recent messages exchanged with a contact whose name he didn't recognize. The conversations were brief, but loaded with implications. "Today was perfect," one of the messages read. "I can't wait for next time." Daniel's heart raced. That was the confirmation he had been dreading. He felt crushed by the reality he had tried to deny. When Mariana came out of the shower, she found Daniel sitting on the bed, holding his cell phone. The silence in the room was almost deafening. "Do you want to explain this to me?" he asked, his voice low but charged with emotion. Mariana remained motionless, staring at the device in his hands. Her expression quickly changed from surprise to panic. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. The betrayal was finally exposed. But Daniel knew there was still something more, something she wasn't saying. And he was determined to find out what it was. Silence filled the room like a tangible presence. Mariana stood with her hair still damp and the towel wrapped around her body, while Daniel held his cell phone in his hands. The screen glowed with the messages he had just read. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, pain, anger, and a disappointment that seemed to overflow with every gesture. "Aren't you going to say anything?" he asked, his voice low and controlled, but with an intensity that made the air seem thicker. Mariana tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come out. She knew the truth was in front of him, and any excuse would only make the situation worse. Still, panic gripped her body. She began, but was interrupted by Daniel, who stood up suddenly, throwing his cell phone on the bed. "Don't you dare lie to me now. Not after this." Mariana took a deep breath, trying to find the strength to face Daniel's stare. She knew that this moment was inevitable, but nothing had prepared her for it. "I didn't want it to be like this," she said, her voice wavering. I was confused, lost." "Lost?" Daniel repeated, giving a bitter laugh. "Confused? You didn't seem confused while you were exchanging messages and meeting up with him. You seemed to know exactly what you were doing." Those words pierced Mariana like knives. She knew he was right, but it wasn't that simple. Nothing was simple. "I'm sorry," she murmured, finally giving in to the weight of the guilt she was carrying. "I can't change what happened. I made a mistake, Daniel. I made a bad mistake." Daniel looked at her, his eyes burning with tears that he refused to shed. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice breaking. "You destroyed what we built together. And for what? For him." Mariana looked away, unable to bear the intensity of Daniel's pain. The man's name echoed in her mind, but she knew it wasn't just about him. It was about herself, her insecurities, her unspoken desires. "It's not just about him," she finally answered. "It's about what I was feeling, or not feeling. About what I thought I'd lost." "Lost?" Daniel repeated, louder now. "You didn't lose anything, Mariana. You just chose to throw it all away." The impact of those words brought tears to her eyes. She tried to move closer, but Daniel took a step back, as if an invisible chasm had opened up between them. "I wanted you to know," Mariana began, her voice breaking, "that this wasn't meant to hurt you. I never meant to hurt you." Daniel laughed again, but this time it was sharp. "Do you think that consoles me? That somehow knowing you didn't mean to hurt me makes it all go away?" The two were silent for a few seconds, the sound of their breathing filling the space between them. Finally, Daniel ran his hands through his hair, trying to organize the thoughts that were coming at him in a whirlwind. "What about him?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Who is he? What does he mean to you?" Mariana hesitated. Answering this question seemed impossible. He means nothing," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, they sounded false. "Nothing?" Daniel retorted, incredulous. "You risked everything for nothing?" She didn't answer, and the absence of words was answer enough. Daniel took a step back, feeling the weight of the moment fall on him. "I don't know which is worse," he finally said, his voice low. "The betrayal or your lack of courage to face up to what you've done?" Mariana felt the blow of those words, but before she could reply, Daniel continued, "Do you think it's over here? That I'm just going to accept all this and move on as if nothing had happened?" "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice almost a whisper. I just want you to understand." "Understand?" he shouted, losing control for the first time that night. "Understand what, Mariana? That you destroyed our lives on a whim? That you put our marriage at risk because you were bored?" She cringed at his outburst, but knew he was entitled to his anger. Still, there was more that needed to be said, something she feared revealing but knew she could no longer hide. "There's something you need to know," she began, her voice trembling. Daniel looked at her with a mixture of expectation and skepticism. "I don't want to hear any more excuses," he said, interrupting her. "Whatever it is, keep it to yourself." "It's about him," she insisted, ignoring his attempt to cut off the conversation. "About what it really means." Daniel remained silent, his eyes fixed on her. Something in the way she spoke made the air seem even heavier. He knew that what came next would change everything again, but he wasn't ready to hear it. "What does it mean, Mariana?" he finally asked, his voice tense. She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to overflow. I wasn't the only one," she said at last. He knew about you. He knew about us. And he used that." Daniel frowned, confused. "What are you saying?" "I think he was using me," she admitted, the words coming out with difficulty. "Maybe it was a game for him, something to manipulate me, or to hurt you." The revelation hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Daniel looked at her, trying to absorb what he had just heard. "Did you know this all along?" She shook her head quickly. "No. I realized it later, when I was already involved. And when I wanted to stop, he..." She hesitated, but Daniel's gaze pressed down on her. "He threatened to expose everything," she finally confessed, tears streaming down her face. "He said he would destroy not only our marriage, but also my career, my reputation." Daniel remained silent, the weight of the betrayal now accompanied by a new layer of deceit. The anger was still there, but now there was something else, a feeling that he too had been manipulated, used as a piece in a game he didn't even know was going on. As Mariana's words echoed around the room, one thing became clear to both of them: the real confrontation was yet to come. And it wouldn't just be between the two of them. Daniel remained motionless in the room, as if Mariana's last words had frozen time. The air was heavy, and the silence between them seemed to scream. The revelation that the man had not only been involved with Mariana, but had also manipulated the situation with malicious intent, added a new weight to the betrayal. Daniel didn't know what to do with this information. He felt betrayed on all fronts, by the woman he loved and by a stranger who saw him as a target. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control his breathing. The whirlwind of emotions was suffocating him: anger, humiliation, and now a strange feeling of helplessness. He had always considered himself a rational man, someone capable of dealing with problems objectively, but this wasn't a matter of logic. It was personal, intimate, and devastating. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. His voice was low, but laden with pain. Mariana wiped away the tears with the back of her hand, taking a deep breath before answering. "Because I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of how you would react, afraid of losing everything, and, above all, afraid of what he might do." Daniel watched her with an indecipherable look. He wanted to scream, he wanted to demand answers, but something held him back. Perhaps it was tiredness, or perhaps the knowledge that words wouldn't be enough to repair the damage. He got out of bed and began to walk around the room, running his hand through his hair as he tried to organize his thoughts. "Do you understand what this means?" he said, turning to face her. "You put our lives, our history, in the hands of someone who wanted to destroy everything." "I know," Mariana replied, almost in a whisper, "and I have no excuses for that. All I can say is that it was a terrible mistake, one that I'll carry with me forever." Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "A mistake? Mariana, this is much more than a mistake. This is a betrayal, not just against me, but against everything we've built together." She nodded, letting the tears roll again. But this time she didn't try to justify herself. There was something in Daniel's posture that made her realize that he was beyond any argument. "What now?" he finally asked. "What do you expect me to do with this? Just accept it? Pretend that nothing happened?" Mariana hesitated, but she knew she couldn't ask him to do that. "I don't expect anything," she said sincerely. I know I've lost the right to expect anything from you. I want you to know that I never wanted it to come to this. Daniel watched her for a long moment. He wanted to believe her, wanted to see some redemption in her words, but the weight of what had happened was overwhelming. He took a deep breath and looked out of the window. Outside, the world seemed to be going on as normal, indifferent to the storm raging inside the house. I need some time, he said at last. I need to think. Because right now, I don't know if I can look at you without feeling that. Mariana nodded, even though she knew his words cut her like knives. I understand, she said, her voice breaking. And whatever you decide, I'll respect it. Daniel took his car keys and left the house without saying where he was going. He needed air, space, something to help him process it all. As he drove, his mind went over every detail of the conversation, every nuance that indicated something was wrong before he even realized it. Now, these memories seemed like clues in a puzzle he would rather never have put together. He stopped in a nearby park, parking the car under a tree. He got out and walked over to a bench, sitting down and burying his face in his hands. There, alone, he let the tears fall. It wasn't something he did often, but at that moment it seemed impossible to hold back. How did we get here? He thought. Everything they had built together now seemed fragile, like a house of cards about to collapse. He wanted to find a way to get over it, but the pain and anger were overwhelming. And there was another issue he couldn't get out of his head, the man. Who was he? Why had he done it? And, above all, what did he hope to gain from all this? Daniel knew he couldn't move on without these answers. He needed to understand the extent of what he was facing before deciding what to do. Meanwhile, Mariana was at home, sitting on the sofa in the living room. The silence was almost deafening, and Daniel's absence made the weight of the situation seem even greater. She knew he needed space, but the emptiness he left behind was unbearable. She tried to distract herself, but her mind kept returning to the moment when everything began to fall apart. Mariana knew that she had crossed a line from which she could not return, but she also knew that she was not prepared to lose everything without a fight. She wanted to tell Daniel more, she wanted to explain in detail what had happened, but she feared it would be too late. Still, a part of her believed that if she could be completely honest, there might be a chance to rebuild what had been destroyed. Hours later, Daniel returned home. Mariana was waiting for him, sitting in the living room with an expression of obvious anxiety. When he entered, she immediately stood up, but he gestured for her not to speak. I didn't come here to argue, he said firmly. I still don't know what to do, but there's one thing I need to make clear. This isn't over. Not for me. Not for us. I need answers, Mariana. Answers that only you can give me. She nodded, feeling the weight of his words. I'm ready to answer everything, she said, her voice trembling. Whatever you want to know. Then start from the beginning, he said, taking a seat opposite her. Tell me how it started. Everything. I want to know everything. Mariana took a deep breath, knowing there was no more room for lies or omissions. She began to speak, her voice hesitant at first, but gaining strength as the words came out. She recounted how the man had come into her life, how he had approached her, and how, little by little, she had given in to something she knew was wrong. As she spoke, Daniel watched her carefully, trying to make sense of it all. He felt that the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, but the picture that emerged was not a pretty one. It was a story of weakness, manipulation and poor choices that had led to the collapse of everything he valued. When she finished, silence filled the room again. Daniel stood still for a long time, absorbing everything he had heard. Finally, he stood up and looked at her. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said sincerely. But I know I have to face this man. I need to face him. Because it won't be over until he's confronted. Mariana nodded, knowing that Daniel was determined. But what she didn't know was what this confrontation could bring, both for him and for the two of them. The office was cold and impersonal, with a fluorescent light that seemed to further highlight the lines of tension on Daniel's face. He was sitting facing the man who was responsible for all the pain in his life. The man, whose presence was calculated and full of self-confidence, watched him with a slight smile at the corner of his lips, as if he already knew how the conversation would end. "So, you're the betrayed husband," he said, with a tone that mixed sarcasm and disdain. "What exactly are you hoping to achieve here?" Daniel took a deep breath, trying to control the anger that threatened to explode. "I want answers," he said firmly. "I want to understand what made you get involved in my life like that. You weren't just having a relationship with my wife. You were destroying everything we had built." The man leaned back in his chair, as if the accusation had no weight. "You're an intelligent man, Daniel. You don't need me to explain. This wasn't personal. It was an opportunity." "An opportunity?" Daniel repeated, incredulous. "An opportunity for what?" "To prove how miserable you can be. To play with people's lives." The man laughed, an empty, cutting sound. "People create their own tragedies. Mariana came to me, not the other way around. You should look at it as your fault, not mine." Those words hit Daniel like a blow, but he refused to back down. "You manipulated the situation. You threatened to expose it, you knew it would cause destruction. What's in it for you?" The man crossed his arms, the smile disappearing from his face. "I gain power. Control. You don't understand why you live stuck in your moralities. But for me, people are pieces in a game. Mariana was a useful piece, that's all. Just as you are now." Daniel felt his blood boil, but his mind was clear. He knew there was no point in resorting to violence or shouting. The only thing that could defeat that man would be to take away the control he valued so much. "You think you've won," said Daniel, leaning forward. "But you don't know everything. I have proof, messages, records. I know how you used Mariana, how you manipulated her. I can expose that. Not only will your reputation be over, but so will everything you've built." The man frowned for the first time, a shadow of concern crossing his face. "You wouldn't have the courage," he said, but the doubt in his voice was evident. Daniel stood up, adjusting his jacket. "You're wrong about me. I'm not the weak man you think I am. And I'm not going to let you get away with this." Without waiting for an answer, Daniel left the office, leaving the man alone, his expression now marked by a fear he couldn't hide. At home, Mariana was sitting on the sofa, waiting for Daniel to arrive. She knew he had gone to find the man, but had no idea what had happened. When Daniel came in, she immediately stood up, her heart racing. "How was it?" she asked hesitantly. Daniel looked at her, his gaze steady but tired. "He's exactly what I imagined. An empty man who only knows how to destroy. But I'm not going to let him keep doing that." Mariana nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. "What about us?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "What happens to us now?" Daniel was silent for a long moment, watching her. Finally, he sighed. "I don't know, Mariana. I want to believe that we can get through this, but what you did changed everything. I need time. And maybe you do too." Mariana swallowed, knowing he was right. "I'll fight for us," she said sincerely. "Even if it takes years. I want to repair what I've destroyed." Daniel didn't reply. Instead, he picked up the keys again and went for a walk. He knew he needed more than words to get over it. And, deep down, he didn't know if he could. Months later, both their lives had changed significantly. Mariana took time off work and sought professional help to deal with the traumas and choices that had led to her betrayal. She knew she couldn't recover the past, but she wanted to build a future that, even apart from Daniel, would be more honest and upright. Daniel, for his part, moved on, but not without marks. He used the evidence he had to expose the man, destroying his reputation and ending any possibility of him continuing to manipulate others. Although this didn't erase the pain, it gave Daniel a sense of justice that he needed to move on. Their marriage didn't survive, but they both found different paths to redemption. And, in a way, the end of that relationship was also the beginning of a new chapter for each of them. Now it's up to you. What did you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more impactful narratives like this one. Remember, betrayal isn't just a mistake, it's a choice that destroys lives. Our channel does not support any kind of betrayal, and our stories are created to reflect the devastating impacts it can have. See you next time.